Good afternoon, folks. Welcome back to the Philosophy for Philistines channel, also known as Politics for Plebeians, with your host, Bill Reimer. I have a long one today entitled, well, we told you so. In a tweet from Dr. John Robson today, he stated, "Some of us did tell you so at the time, and were ridiculed or ignored." Well, told you so, referring to an article written by Matthew Lau, who is an Adjunct Scholar for the Fraser Institute, originally published in the Toronto Sun on Sunday, June the 29th, 2022, and republished by the Fraser Institute. Article entitled, "Politicians Made Horrific Errors Closing School During COVID." I'll read it to you, beginning, quote, "Another school year has come to an end. Eventually there must be a full accounting of the extraordinary restrictions of economic and civil liberties that governments imposed in the past 2 years to mitigate the pandemic. The evidence, what was justifiable, what was not, is not all in, but is everywhere piling up, and one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The politicians who ordered the closing of schools and the activists who cheered them on made a horrific error. The most culpable politicians in Canada are in the Ontario government, which closed schools for a cumulative 29 weeks during various stages of the pandemic, longer, as the Ontario Science Advisory Table noted, than all other provinces in most European countries. This despite the fact it was widely known since the beginning that children had a high level of immunity to the coronavirus. And according to widely available data, including in the relatively early stages of the pandemic, that schools are not the super spreaders of disease some fearmongers claimed. In fact, a new study published in Health Affairs concludes that closing Ontario schools in December 2020, with some regions not reopening until February 2021, reduced the number of estimated coronavirus cases in the province by only 0.08%. A minimal result that lacks statistical significance. This is not an isolated finding. UNICEF reported in November 2020 the data from 191 countries collected from February to September 2020 show no consistent association between school reopening status and COVID-19 infection rates, while noting that the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control concluded that child-to-child transmission in schools was uncommon and not the primary cause of COVID-19 in children who were infected during the time they attended school. In the United States, Brown University economist Emily Oster and other researchers collected data on coronavirus cases in classrooms. By September 2020, their data covered 100,000 students learning in person. By February 2021, it covered about 12 million students, about half learning in person. As Oster wrote a year into the pandemic, in the early rounds of data collection, it became clear schools were not super spreaders. This has been reinforced again and again in our data, in other data, in the lived experience of the last year, close quote. Similarly, authors of a working paper circulated by the National Bureau for Economic Research in February 2021 examined data from Michigan and Washington and concluded, after controlling for relevant factors, the relationship between in-person learning and increased coronavirus cases was close to zero on average. And a German study from October 2020 found schools reopening after summer break did not increase coronavirus cases. what was the cost of school closures, which achieved essentially zero public health benefit? A massive hit to the social and educational development of children, widespread distress for parents, significant economic disruption, and more. A U.S. study found steep test scores declined due to school closures, disproportionately affecting the most disadvantaged children. A survey of Ontario parents found that about 3/4 believe that their child fell behind in school during the pandemic. The school closures were temporary, but many of the effects, including reduced educational development, will be long-lasting. As time passes, the evidence on the cost and benefits of coronavirus restrictions will continue to accumulate. But it's already clear that the politicians responsible for school closures made a horrific error, and they should be held accountable. Close quote. And I provide the link for the article below on the notes for this podcast. And although this piece reveals the irreversible damage done to our children from closing schools, it also hints at the economic damage of lockdowns. Damages which will have grave consequences on international and regional economies for decades to come. Yeah, we told you so, all right. Yes, with no pleasure whatsoever, we warned you. Yet few would listen to our factual assessment of state policies which were designed to fail. Today we are witnessing skyrocketing inflation and interest rates as a result of printing money out of thin air. A global energy crisis brought on by insane green energy policies that literally contradict the laws of the conservation of matter and energy, which have been applied in concert with idiotic foreign policies. Yet the West pursued energy dependency on illiberal authoritarian regimes to supply us with gas and oil rather than ethically mining and refining our own resources. The war in the Ukraine, the emergent Russia-China coalition, which has resulted from unworkable foreign policies, is placing the entire free world at risk with risk of war with totalitarian powers that have leveraged our dependence on them to destabilize global hegemony in their favor. At home, we have an ever-increasing centralized government featuring a bureaucratic war on the free movement of people and goods. In Holland, there is even a war in the farming industry during a time of food shortages, as demonstrated by the current enormous tractor protest there. The Dutch government has claimed there is too much nitrogen in the soil, the very fertilizer which drives the engine of crop production during a time of food shortage. Well, I could go on and on. What we are witnessing on a global scale is a level of statism which would make Hitler, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao green with envy over the coordinated global takedown of free markets and economic well-being. Most often, however, it is the little things that make me pause and wonder. How on earth people can be so enamored of our corrupt political class which exist in the defiance of common sense and the rule of law. The small annoying incidences which make me increasingly aware of how completely deluded the hangers-on are who exist on the fringes of the current powerful class of moralizing elitists and therefore are dependent on their largesse and march in lockstep with their ideological delusion. Just the other night I discovered yet another reason to detest this godless capital city, which hates constitutional limits on government and peaceful lawful protests. Anasiri and I went to our favorite roadhouse and took a booth. Seated in the booth next to us were two woke ideologues who were complaining bitterly to a sympathizing waitress that the U.S. Supreme Court's decision about the U.S. Supreme Court's decision regarding Roe versus Wade. I have several thoughts regarding their faux moralizing, hubris, and ignorance. Firstly, the overturning of Roe versus Wade places the control of abortion into the hands of each state as a recognition of states' rights guaranteed in the U.S. Constitution. It, therefore, does not prevent women from accessing an abortion. Secondly, Trudeau's government has repeatedly exceeded its legal constitutional mandate to govern and is using our police as its personal Stasi to enforce arbitrary dictates on Canadians. This blatant fact wasn't even on the radar of these women, which only proves how willfully blind they were. Thirdly, I couldn't believe the level of zeal these women expressed, couching self-righteous, arrogant virtue over the right to end a human life. As I sat next to these feminazi ghouls, I lost my appetite. They were the same species of deluded women who scream, "My body, my choice," when murdering the unborn, yet have insisted that everyone receive the mRNA inoculation by approving wholeheartedly that our federal government and provincial governments should enforce this intrusive protocol on us in defiance of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They serve to make my dining experience yet another reminder of why I hate living in this neo-Marxist city of woke ideologues who are far too dull-witted to understand the difference between American states' rights and our abusive, centralized system of governance that abhors local democracy and personal autonomy. Worse, they didn't care to understand the law and its proper application. They just march in lockstep to the witless dolt PM of ours who had the temerity to lecture the U.S. Supreme Court how to interpret their constitutional law while he ignores the very charter laws his father's government repatriated to Canada. A pox be upon this lawless generation. And yes, we told you so. When eloquent academics are dedicating their entire careers to warning us where we are headed ideologically, and that government policies based on ideological possession can only result in societal ruin, we are obliged to heed their legitimate concerns. I best sign off now before I launch into some sort of apoplectic seizure. Have a lovely afternoon. Those are things to think about. And I invite you to debate these issues with me, because I can prove, using factual evidence, that what I have stated is absolute fact. Have a great afternoon.